You were sold to me. Now spread those legs. Giant bride commands, lonely cowboy. The wagon rattled to a halt outside the ramshackle homestead, its wheels groaning against frozen earth. Silas Webb stood in the doorway of his cabin, his narrow frame trembling, not from the biting wind that swept across the Wyoming plains, but from anticipation twisted with dread. 3 months had passed since he'd placed that advertisement in the territorial newspaper. 3 months of wondering if anyone would answer a lonely homesteader's desperate plea for companionship. The marriage broker's letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, curt and businesslike, stating only that his bride would arrive on the 15th of November. No name, no description, just a date and a price already paid. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, climbed down and spat into the dust. He glanced at Silas with something between pity and amusement before walking to the back of the wagon. When he opened the gate, Silas's breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged, and the wagon springs groaned with relief as massive boots hit the ground. She stood easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a prizefighter and arms corded with muscle that strained against the fabric of her dress. But it was the dress itself that made Silas's mind reel. A wedding gown, ivory silk, now road-worn and patched in places, with lace yellowing at the edges and a train that dragged through the dirt. Her face was hard-angled and weathered, framed by dark hair pulled back severely, and her eyes swept across the property with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a battlefield. The driver cleared his throat. "This here's Bertha Cole, your bride." He emphasized the last word with barely concealed mockery. "Good luck to you both." He was back on the wagon before Silas could respond, whipping the horses into motion and leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silas stood frozen, his prepared greeting dying on his lips. Bertha hefted 2 enormous trunks as though they weighed nothing and walked toward him. Her wedding dress rustled with each powerful stride, an incongruous sound that made the moment feel like a fever dream. When she reached the porch, she set down the trunks and looked at him properly for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, guarded in a way that spoke of too many cruel stares and whispered judgments. "You Silas Webb?" Her voice was deeper than he'd expected, rough around the edges like wind-scoured stone. He managed a nod, his own voice trapped somewhere in his chest. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his slight build, his nervous fidgeting, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. Then she picked up her trunks again and stepped past him into the cabin. "Good enough," she said. "Show me where to put these." Silas scrambled to follow, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not what he had imagined, not even close. And yet, as she stood in the center of his small home, her wedding dress somehow dignified despite its condition, he felt the first stirring of something he couldn't name. Not fear, exactly, not disappointment, something else entirely. The interior of the cabin seemed to shrink around Bertha's presence. She set the trunks down near the far wall, her movements efficient and practiced. Silas hovered near the door, unsure whether to speak or wait for her to break the silence. The small room contained little: a narrow bed in one corner, a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and shelves holding tin plates and jars of preserved vegetables. A single window looked out toward the barn and the endless prairie beyond. Bertha turned slowly, taking inventory of the space, and Silas wondered what she saw. Poverty, certainly. Isolation. the desperate circumstances of a man who would send away for a wife sight unseen. "It ain't much," he finally managed, his voice cracking slightly, "but the land's good. Got 40 acres. Stream runs through the eastern section. Barn needs work, but it's sound enough for the animals." He was babbling now, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence with facts and figures. Bertha walked to the window and looked out at the barn, her broad back to him. The evening light caught the wrinkles in her dress, the careful stitching where tears had been mended. She said nothing, and Silas felt panic rising in his chest. Perhaps she would leave. Perhaps she would demand the wagon return for her. Perhaps she had seen enough of his pathetic homestead to know this had been a terrible mistake. "I can cook," he added quickly. "Not fancy, but decent enough. And I keep things clean. I know I ain't. That is, I know you probably expected someone stronger, someone who could—" He stopped when she turned to face him, her expression still guarded, but with something softer around the eyes. "Mr. Webb," she interrupted, her voice low and measured, "I ain't here to judge your strength or your housekeeping. The broker said you needed a wife. I needed a place where folks might leave me be. That's the arrangement." She crossed her arms, the muscles in her forearms flexing beneath sun-darkened skin. "I'll pull my weight. More than my weight, if we're being honest. You got work that needs doing?" Relief flooded through Silas so suddenly he felt lightheaded. She wasn't leaving, at least not yet. He nodded quickly. "The north barn beam came down in last week's storm. Been trying to lever it back up, but I can't—" He stopped, afraid she might take offense at his admission of weakness. Bertha's expression remained neutral. "Show me," she said simply, as they walked toward the barn, the hem of her wedding dress trailing through the dirt. Silas noticed how she moved, confident and sure-footed despite her size, like someone accustomed to navigating a world not built for her dimensions. He wondered about her story, about what circumstances had led her to answer his advertisement, but something in her bearing told him those questions would not be welcome. Not yet. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and inside, the large support beam lay at an angle across the floor, having crashed down from its moorings. Silas had tried for days to hoist it back into place, but the weight was simply beyond him. Bertha stepped inside, her dress rustling against hay bales and scattered tools. She examined the beam, the damaged support brackets, and the height where it needed to be secured. Then, without a word, she bent and gripped the beam with both hands. The muscles in her back and arms bunched beneath the fabric of her dress as she lifted. The beam rose slowly, steadily, until it reached shoulder height. She adjusted her grip, braced her legs, and pushed it higher still. Silas stood frozen, watching this display of raw strength with a mixture of awe and something he couldn't quite name. "The brackets," Bertha said through gritted teeth, holding the beam aloft. Silas jerked into motion, scrambling for the iron brackets and nails. His hands shook as he positioned the first bracket and hammered it into place. The sound of metal on metal rang through the barn. He secured the second bracket, then the third, working as quickly as his trembling fingers would allow. When the final nail was driven home, Bertha slowly released the beam. It held. She stepped back, rolling her shoulders, and the wedding dress shifted around her powerful frame. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Silas found his voice. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I've been trying for near about a week." Bertha looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. The guardedness remained, but beneath it he glimpsed a weariness that went bone deep. "You thought I'd mock you for needing help?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. Silas felt heat rise to his face. "I thought you might wonder what kind of man can't lift his own barn beam. What kind of man needs to send away for a wife because no one local would have him?" The words came out in a rush, the shame he'd been carrying for months finally given voice. Bertha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I spent most of my life being gawked at, Mr. Webb, being called freak and monster and worse, being pushed out of towns because I made folks uncomfortable. I know what it's like to be judged for what you are instead of who you are." She gestured at her wedding dress, the gesture almost defiant. "I wear this because it was the only time anyone ever looked at me like I might be something other than a curiosity. The man who gave it to me, he died before we could marry. Cholera took him in 3 days, but for a little while I was somebody's bride, somebody's choice, and I ain't willing to let that go." The confession hung in the air between them. Silas felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He understood, perhaps better than she knew, what it meant to cling to the one thing that made you feel human. "You can call me Silas," he said quietly, "and I'm glad you're here, Miss Bertha. I truly am." The first week unfolded in a series of careful negotiations and small revelations. They established a routine born of necessity and mutual respect. Bertha took to the heavy labor with the same quiet competence she'd shown with the barn beam. She cleared fallen trees from the property line, their trunks thick enough that they would have taken Silas days to move with saw and rope. She dug post holes for new fencing, her powerful arms driving the digger deep into the frozen ground. She hauled water from the stream in barrels that Silas could barely budge. And through it all, she wore her wedding dress, the ivory silk growing more stained and tattered with each passing day. Silas tried once to suggest she might prefer something more practical, but the look she gave him made it clear the subject was not open for discussion. For his part, Silas took over the domestic duties with a thoroughness that surprised them both. He rose early to tend the fire and prepare breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or biscuits with bacon when they had it. He kept the cabin clean, swept the floors, washed their clothes in the big copper tub behind the barn. He discovered that Bertha had a sweet tooth, and he began experimenting with molasses cakes and dried apple pies. In the evenings, while she sat at the table rubbing liniment into her aching muscles, he would carefully mend the tears in her wedding dress, his small hands surprisingly deft with needle and thread. She never thanked him for this, but he noticed she would touch the repaired section sometimes, her calloused fingers gentle against the silk. Their conversations were sparse at first, limited to practical matters, where to stack the firewood, how much grain the chickens needed, when to butcher the pig. But gradually, in the quiet moments after supper or while working side by side, fragments of their histories emerged. Silas learned that Bertha had been born in a German immigrant community in Pennsylvania, that her unusual size and strength had manifested early, that her parents had loved her but hadn't known how to protect her from a world that saw her as aberration. She'd worked in factories, on docks, in mines, any place that valued her strength over her appearance. The wedding dress had belonged to her mother, altered and enlarged for a ceremony that never happened. "He was a good man," she said once, gazing into the fire. "Didn't care what folks said, but then he was gone, and I was alone again." Silas shared his own story in halting fragments. His sickly childhood, his parents' deaths from influenza, the years spent as a store clerk in Kansas City, where the other men mocked his thin frame and timid nature. The money left to him by an aunt had been enough to file for this homestead claim, and he'd poured everything into proving up the land. But the isolation had been crushing, and the physical demands had pushed him to his limits. I thought if I had a partner, someone to share the load, maybe I could make something of this place. Maybe I could be more than what everyone always said I was: weak, useless, half a man. He'd expected Bertha to dismiss his confession, but instead she'd nodded slowly. "We're both trying to be more than what the world decided we should be," she said. "Seems like a good enough reason to make this work." The turning point came 3 weeks into their arrangement. A brutal, cold snap descended on the Wyoming plains, bringing with it howling winds and temperatures that froze water in the bucket overnight. Silas woke one morning to find ice coating the inside of the windows and his breath misting in the cabin air. When he tried to rekindle the fire, he realized they were nearly out of split wood. The pile outside was frozen together in a massive block, and the unsplit logs were too large for him to manage. Bertha was already up, standing by the window in her nightdress, a simple cotton shift, with a blanket draped over her shoulders. "I'll get the wood," she said before he could speak. Silas started to protest, to say he should at least help, but she was already pulling on her boots and shrugging into a coat that barely fit across her shoulders. He watched through the frosted window as she attacked the woodpile. Her breath steamed in the frigid air as she swung the axe, each blow splitting logs with a single strike. Her movements were rhythmic, almost meditative, and despite the cold, she'd shed the coat within minutes. When she finally came back inside, her arms laden with split wood, her face was flushed with exertion, and her nightdress clung to her sweat-dampened skin. She dumped the wood by the stove and immediately set about building up the fire. Silas stood holding the coffee pot he'd been preparing, struck by the contradiction she embodied. This powerful woman in her nightdress, tenderly coaxing flames to life. "You'll catch your death," he said, finding his voice, "standing there all wet in this cold." Bertha glanced at him, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw her smile, not broadly, just a slight quirk of her lips, but genuine. "I'm fine. Got more padding than you." She gestured at her solid frame. "You, on the other hand, look like a strong wind might blow you away. Get that coffee going and we'll both warm up." As Silas prepared the coffee, adding extra sugar the way she liked it, he felt something shift in the atmosphere of the cabin. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite formality, began to dissolve. When he handed her the steaming cup, their fingers brushed, and neither of them pulled away immediately. She took a long drink, sighed with satisfaction, and looked at him with an expression that was almost fond. "You make good coffee, Silas," she said, using his given name for the first time without the formal Mr. prefacing it. "You split wood better than anyone I've ever seen, Bertha," he replied, and was rewarded with another small smile. They stood together by the warming stove, drinking their coffee in companionable silence. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, but inside the cabin, something tender and unexpected was taking root. That evening, after supper, Silas retrieved her wedding dress from where it hung on a peg and examined it in the lamplight. The hem was badly frayed, the lace torn in several places from snagging on fence posts and barn wood. He settled into his chair and began the careful work of repair, his needle moving in small, precise stitches. Bertha watched him from the table where she was oiling her work boots. "Why do you do that?" she asked quietly. "Fix my dress?" Silas considered the question, wanting to answer honestly. "Because it matters to you," he said finally, "and what matters to you matters to me." He paused in his stitching, meeting her eyes. "We're married, aren't we? Even if it was arranged, even if we're still learning each other. I figure that means I'm supposed to care about the things that are important to you." Bertha was quiet for so long that Silas wondered if he'd overstepped. Then she rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. She knelt beside him, bringing them nearly eye to eye despite their height difference, and gently took the dress from his hands. She studied his careful stitchwork, running her fingers over the mended tiers. "You're a good man, Silas Webb," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Better than you give yourself credit for." "And you're a good woman, Bertha Cole," he replied, "no matter what anyone else says." She handed the dress back to him and returned to her chair. But something fundamental had changed between them. The walls they'd each maintained, the protective distance born of too many disappointments and cruelties, began to crumble. Over the following weeks, their partnership deepened into something neither of them had expected. They worked in tandem, learning each other's rhythms and strengths. Bertha would fell trees, and Silas would strip the branches. She would dig the garden plots, and he would plant the seeds. She would carry the heavy sacks of grain from town, and he would measure out the chickens' feed. In the evenings, they would sit together, and Bertha began to teach him about the stars, knowledge she'd picked up from years of sleeping rough between jobs. The physical intimacy of marriage had not been part of their arrangement, and neither pushed for it. But there were other intimacies that grew between them. The comfortable silence of people who understand each other, the shared laughter over small jokes, the way Bertha would rest her hand on Silas's shoulder when passing behind his chair, the way he would make sure her favorite cup was always clean and waiting. One night, during a fierce thunderstorm, Silas woke to find the cabin door open and Bertha standing on the porch in her wedding dress, face upturned to the rain. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and joined her. "You all right?" he asked over the sound of the downpour. She didn't look at him, but her voice carried clearly. "I used to be afraid of storms. When I was a girl, my ma would hold me and tell me the thunder was just God moving furniture in heaven." "That's a nice thought," Silas said. Bertha nodded. "After she died, storms made me feel small and alone. But tonight, standing here, I don't feel that way anymore." She turned to look at him then, rain streaming down her face. "I feel like I'm home." Silas felt his throat tighten. He reached out and took her hand, his small fingers enveloped by her larger ones. "You are home," he said simply. They stood together on the porch, watching the storm rage across the prairie, and Silas realized that somewhere in the past weeks, this strange, unconventional arrangement had become exactly what they both needed. Two people who had been cast aside by a world too rigid to see their worth had found each other and built something real. The peaceful rhythm of their days shattered on a gray morning in early March. Silas had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Visitors were rare on their isolated homestead, and his first thought was that Bertha might need him. She was out working on the new barn extension. He dried his hands and stepped outside, squinting against the weak sunlight. The wagon that rolled to a stop before the cabin was well appointed, pulled by matched bay horses that spoke of money. The man who climbed down wore a city suit and a self-satisfied expression that made Silas's stomach clench with instinctive wariness. "Good morning," the man called out, his voice carrying the oily charm of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I'm looking for the landowner. This the Webb homestead?" "It is," Silas replied, not moving from the porch. "What's your business?" The man produced a leather document case from the wagon. "Name's Chester Vance. I represent the Territorial Land Development Company. I've got some important papers here regarding your property." He climbed the porch steps without invitation, forcing Silas to either step aside or be physically pushed. Silas held his ground for a moment, then reluctantly moved. Vance set his case on the porch railing and extracted a sheaf of official-looking documents. "According to our records, there's an outstanding debt on this land. Previous claim holder took a loan from our company 3 years back. Debt's been called in, and as the current occupant, you're liable for repayment. $500, plus accumulated interest." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. $500 might as well have been 5,000. He'd spent nearly everything he had just proving up the claim and making it through the first winter. "There must be some mistake," he said, hearing the tremor in his own voice. "I filed legal claim on this land through the territorial office. There was no mention of any debt." Vance smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, that's a matter for the courts, isn't it? In the meantime, I've got the authority to foreclose if the debt isn't settled within 30 days. Of course, I might be persuaded to extend that timeline if you were willing to sell the property to my company at a fair price. Say $50 for the land and improvements." $50? Silas's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "This land's worth 10 times that minimum. You're trying to steal it." Vance's expression hardened. "I'm trying to help you avoid the embarrassment of foreclosure. But if you'd rather take your chances with territorial law, that's your choice. Just remember, courts favor established business interests over squatters, even ones with fancy papers." He stepped closer, and Silas could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "Let's be honest here, Mr. Webb. You're not exactly thriving. I saw the state of this place when I rode in. Man like you, all alone, barely keeping body and soul together. You'd probably be happier back in town, doing clerk work or some other job better suited to your constitution." The contempt in Vance's voice was unmistakable, and Silas felt the familiar burn of shame and anger. He wanted to stand tall, to order this man off his property with the kind of authority that would brook no argument, but the words wouldn't come. Years of being dismissed, of being told he wasn't man enough for any real challenge, had left their mark too deep. He stood there, trembling with impotent rage, as Vance smirked at his silence. Then he heard the creak of heavy footsteps on the porch boards. Bertha had returned from the barn, drawn by the sound of the unfamiliar wagon. She took in the scene, Vance looming over Silas, the papers spread across the railing, the predatory satisfaction on the speculator's face. Her expression remained calm, but Silas had learned to read the subtle signs of her anger. "What's going on here?" Bertha asked, her deep voice cutting through the tension. She still wore her wedding dress, now liberally stained with dirt and sawdust from the morning's work. Vance turned, and Silas watched the man's face go through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then a poorly concealed disgust. "And who might you be?" Vance asked, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "The hired help?" Bertha climbed the steps, and Silas noticed Vance unconsciously retreat a step as she approached. "I'm Bertha Webb, his wife. Now what's this about debt on our land?" Vance recovered his composure, though his eyes kept darting between Bertha's face and her wedding dress, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Your land has an outstanding obligation to the Territorial Land Development Company. I'm here to collect." Bertha held out her hand. "Let me see those papers." Vance hesitated, then handed over the documents. Bertha read slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Silas knew she'd had little formal schooling, but she was far from stupid. She read each page carefully, her finger tracing the lines of text. When she finished, she looked up at Vance. "These papers say the debt was incurred by a man named Samuel Pritchard. That ain't my husband's name." Vance waved his hand dismissively. "The debt stays with the land, not the individual. Your husband filed claim on land that had an existing encumbrance. That makes him liable." "Says who?" Bertha asked. "I don't see anything in these papers about the debt transferring to new claimants. Just says it's owed by Samuel Pritchard." She handed the papers back to Vance. "Seems to me you need to collect from Mr. Pritchard, not from us." Vance's face flushed red. "Listen here, you oversized freak. I don't need a lecture on law from something that doesn't even know if it's man or woman. This land is under lien, and if you two don't pay up or clear out, I'll have the sheriff out here to enforce the claim." The slur hung in the air like a physical blow. Silas saw Bertha's hands clench into fists, saw the muscle in her jaw twitch. But when she spoke, her voice remained eerily calm. "Mr. Vance, I'm going to give you one chance to apologize to my husband and leave our property peacefully." Vance laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Or what? You'll beat me with your bridal bouquet?" He turned to Silas. "Is this what you've reduced yourself to, hiding behind this circus attraction? No wonder you had to send away for a wife. No decent woman would—" He never finished the sentence. Bertha moved faster than Silas would have thought possible for someone her size. One moment, Vance was standing on the porch, sneering. The next, Bertha had grabbed him by his expensive coat and lifted him clean off the ground. He dangled in her grip like a child's doll, his feet kicking uselessly. "Now you listen to me," Bertha said, her voice low and dangerous. "My husband is twice the man you'll ever be. He's kind and decent, and he treats me with respect, which is more than trash like you deserves. You're going to take your fake papers and your threats, and you're going to leave." "Put me down!" Vance sputtered, his face turning purple. "This is assault. I'll have you arrested." Bertha carried him down the porch steps as easily as she might carry a sack of flour. She walked him to his wagon and deposited him roughly on the seat. "You go ahead and try," she said. "While you're at it, why don't you explain to the sheriff how you tried to steal land based on a debt that ain't legally transferable? I may not be a lawyer, but I can read just fine." She leaned in close, and even from the porch, Silas could hear the steel in her voice. "And if you ever come back here, if you ever threaten my husband again, what happened today will seem gentle by comparison. Do we understand each other?" Vance grabbed the reins with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he spat. You haven't heard the last of this." But his bravado was hollow, and they all knew it. He whipped the horses into motion, the wagon lurching forward. Bertha stood in the yard, hands on her hips, watching until he disappeared over the horizon. Only then did she turn back to the cabin. Silas stood frozen on the porch, his heart racing. When Bertha climbed the steps, he saw the way her hands trembled, the aftermath of adrenaline and barely controlled fury. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, but he could see the lie in it. "Bertha," he said softly, and she finally met his eyes. In that moment, he saw past the anger to the hurt beneath, the old wounds that Vance's words had reopened. Without thinking, Silas stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, or as far around as they would reach. It was awkward, this small man trying to embrace a woman so much larger, but he held on tight. For a moment, Bertha stood rigid, as if uncertain how to respond. Then her arms came up around him, gentle despite their strength, and she rested her chin on top of his head. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the pale morning light. When they finally separated, Bertha's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have lost my temper like that. If he goes to the sheriff—" Silas shook his head firmly. "You defended our home. You defended me. If anyone should apologize, it's me. I just stood there, frozen like I always do, while you don't have to be the one who fights," Bertha interrupted. "There's other kinds of strength, Silas. You think I don't know that by now?" She gestured at the cabin, the neat yard, the thriving garden plot. "You've made this place a home. You've taken care of me in ways no one else ever has. That ain't nothing." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "We take care of each other," he said. "That's what this is." Bertha nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess it is." They went inside together, and Silas made tea while Bertha sat at the table, the tension slowly draining from her frame. As he set the cup before her, he thought about what had just happened. Vance had been wrong about so many things, but he'd been right about one. They were an unconventional pair. But in that moment, with Bertha's hand reaching out to cover his smaller one, Silas couldn't bring himself to care what the world thought. They had found each other against all odds, two people who had been told they weren't enough. Together, they were more than enough. That evening, as the sun set over the Wyoming plains in a blaze of orange and gold, Silas stood in the doorway of their cabin. Behind him, he could hear Bertha moving around preparing for bed, the rustle of her wedding dress as she carefully hung it on its peg. The sound had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Vance might make good on his threats. The land might face legal scrutiny. Winter would come again with its brutal demands. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they were home. Silas turned back to the warm glow of the cabin where Bertha stood silhouetted in the lamplight. She looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read, part gratitude, part affection, part fierce protectiveness. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, genuine and open in a way he suspected few people ever got to see. They had built something here in the wilderness, something that defied easy categorization or conventional understanding. They had built a partnership rooted in mutual respect and growing love. As he crossed the threshold and closed the door against the gathering darkness, Silas thought about Vance's parting threat. Let him come back. Let the whole world come if it wanted to. They would face it together, this unlikely bride in her tattered wedding dress, and this quiet man who had finally found his strength, not in muscles or bravado, but in the courage to be himself and the wisdom to recognize love when it arrived in an unexpected package. Home is where healing begins. And for Silas and Bertha, healing had finally, wonderfully begun.